Hi, it's Rick Prescott here to talk about my book, Save the Beatles. This book came out in April of 2020, 50 years to the day from when Paul McCartney announced that the Beatles were, for all intents and purposes, broken up. Basically, as you can see the subtitle, The Rescued Albums 1970 to 1982. Now, of course, everybody everywhere has done the take your favorite solo tracks from the Beatles and put them together into a pseudo-Beatles album. That's a pretty common thing, and a parlor game that's been going on for the last 50 years, and I've played that game too. But this book is not that. It'll sound like that, and it's in certain ways, and yet it's much more than that, because putting a Beatles album together turns out to be a very complicated process, and it isn't just about putting your favorite tracks or anybody's favorite tracks or the hits or even just the songs that were recorded at the same time together. It really actually has almost nothing to do with any of those factors, and of them the one that means the most is when they were recorded. So basically what I did was separated the first 10 years of the solo era. Obviously, we can't go past December of 1980, and I started in late 1969. The earliest sessions for solo albums were Ringo's Sentimental Journey, and I started there, and I separated the 10 years into eras. And I'm calling them fusion eras mostly because what we'll do is we'll take the songs recorded within a specific time period and try and take those to create the album. The specific time periods are a combination of when tracks were available and when they would have needed to put out an album based on what market conditions were and their normal schedule and how all of the pieces came together. And that's a pretty simple place to start. But then there's another piece that there are two other pieces that have to be involved in order to make sense of that. Because as we know, not everything that solo Beatles recorded was good enough to be on a Beatles album. Some of it absolutely was, and that continues through the whole decade. But as time passes, it's a little bit harder to find material that actually is Beatle quality and that in the solo works that can actually come together to form a Beatles album. And that's going to sound a little bit like a criticism. It's really not, because basically what happened over time is that each of the individual Beatles grew away from the band. Each of the individual Beatles developed a style, figured out how to be a solo artist. They went all their separate ways. This is all stuff that I know. If you're a Beatles fan, you're already familiar with this. But the first thing that I did was I listened to every single track that was recorded and either released or tucked away that I could get my hands on for each individual period. And I created lists, and in each case I put the track into one of three categories. Either yes, it's good enough to be on a Beatles album, or no, it's not good enough to be on a Beatles album, or maybe if the circumstances were right, it would be good enough to be on a Beatles album. In most cases, what I call the provisional tracks are going to be left behind. They're not going to become up. But every once in a while, one of those provisional tracks can fill in a gap on a running order for an album, and that's where it gets kind of interesting on how those can get used. But listening and selecting those tracks was really only the starting point. Because the next question is, how did the Beatles put their albums together? I mean, you might put a Beatles album together one way by collecting your favorite songs. I might put it together a different way by picking out, a collection of themed tracks or something like that. But the question is, how did they put their albums together? And this is a subject that hasn't been studied in great detail until now. And that's a big piece of Save the Beatles, is that I start with the original albums, the original classic albums, and I look at them for signs of how they were assembled, which is to say, how did George Martin select the tracks that were going to be on those albums? Because it was almost always George Martin until very late in their career. And then how did he put them in order to get the most out of them? Now, that may seem like something that's not worth looking at. It may seem like something that is too into the weeds. But there's a critical piece that isn't acknowledged nearly as much as it should be, and that is that George Martin knew how to take the tracks and put them in the order where they could sound the best, each one building on the strengths of the others, hiding the imperfections or hiding the weaknesses, and creating, by doing that, a whole that was greater than the sum of its parts. This is an incredible artistic accomplishment on the part of George Martin. And he sequenced albums all the way up to and including Sgt. Pepper. After that, John and Paul were involved in greater detail on the White Album, and they essentially did it themselves with a little bit of help from George Martin on Abbey Road. Let It Be, of course, was sequenced by Phil Spector, and that's a different animal altogether. So my goal was to look at the original albums, pull out the rules, pull out, here's how George Martin did this. Here are the priorities that he had, and here are the techniques he used. Now, in some cases, he wrote about this. He wrote about how he sequenced Sgt. Pepper. In fact, he wrote a whole book, and some would say 2 books, about how to sequence Sgt. Pepper. And it's a fascinating story. And one of the things that I do in this book is pull apart things that he has written about sequencing. But there are a lot of cases where he never wrote anything, he never said anything. All we know is that he did it. I went to Mark Lewison's classic book, The Beatles Recording Sessions, and pulled out all of the information in there about sequencing. There's very little. But you do get a sense for the techniques that he used. The first part of this book is all about how George Martin worked with the Beatles to create running orders that made their music sound the absolute best, to understand why tracks were put in certain places. And there's a lot to be said. I couldn't even summarize it. That's the first part of this book, as we look at how George Martin did that. And there are a couple of proof of concept projects in there. For example, what might have happened if George Martin had taken all of those tracks done after Sgt. Pepper, and instead of letting them become what they became in the Magical Mystery Tour soundtrack, pseudo-soundtrack, the double EP version in the UK or the compilation version in the US. What if George Martin had taken all of those tracks, plus the ones that were in the can at that time, and turned those into a psychedelic follow-up for Sgt. Pepper? Now, of course, everybody has tried to do this. I shouldn't say everybody, but maybe you have tried to do this. And there are a lot of possibilities. But when you understand how George Martin did what he did, you learn something very important about that period of time and that group of music and how it would have come together or not, as the case may be. There's a chapter that talks about that. There's a chapter about what if George Martin had sequenced the Let It Be tracks or the Get Back tracks. Phil Spector did not use the same principles that George Martin used. It's one of the reasons that Let It Be is such a come down from everything else which came before. It's not a come down because of the tracks themselves. It's not a come down because of the songs. It's not a come down because of the performances or the way they recorded it or so-called bad vibes, which apparently didn't actually even exist. We're waiting for the movie. As I do this video, we are waiting for the movie that will give us all sort of the background of how the Get Back sessions went. But if you listen to the music, and I know you have, and if you pull it apart, you realize that no, one of the big problems with Let It Be is that Spector's sequencing doesn't really take good advantage of the tracks in the way that they might. So what if George Martin had sequenced Let It Be? That's a thought experiment that's given some time in this book, just to understand how George Martin did that. By understanding those things, by extracting the principles that George Martin used, I create a sort of George Martin AI, where you can take the music that the solo Beatles made, put it into the George Martin machine, and come out with an album that at least follows those same principles. Now, my idea initially was understand how George Martin did this, understand which music would be eligible, and then see what happened. Would it actually create albums that sounded like the Beatles in the 70s? And anyone who reads the book will be the judge of it. But for my money, it does. For my money, it creates 7 new albums. And I call them fused albums because they pull together the tracks from the individual Beatles and fuse them together into a group project. 7 albums, 2 of which are double albums, and spreads them across that decade and gets at the heart of who the Beatles were in the 70s. And you hear the music in a different way. Now, one of the things to note is that you might think that you know what tracks would be on an album from 1973. And I can't say that the techniques I have used have settled that question once and for all. The question can never be settled. No one can ever know. But once you hear the album that goes with those tracks and understand it in the context of what they were doing at the time as solo artists and how that could have been fused together into a group project, you will hear those tracks differently. I guarantee it. So the second part of this book is the going through each of the fused periods, creating the album. I have a short review for each of the albums that the solo artists did, but also overviews of what was happening chronologically between them at this, what kind of things were going on in their lives, what kind of things were informing the music, and I take all of that information and I use it to put together the running orders that go with this. So there are 7 long chapters in which each one of these albums is, all of the source materials are looked at, and then each album comes together, and how it is sequenced is laid out in great detail so you can see how it is. And then, if nothing else, you might get an idea. You might listen to this and say, I don't like that, but I got a better idea. And I would love that. Because, of course, since we're doing this as a thought experiment, you can have the thought experiments too. So, the third part of this book, and the website, which goes with it, SaveTheBeatles.com, is about the raw materials that I used, so that you can use those raw materials if you want and do your own. I do have a long section that lists out every single track with a thumbnail review, which is only sort of just to keep I remember what that track was. There are 500, almost close to 600 tracks in the 70s that needed to be considered. And then also critical pieces when they were recorded. Not when they were released, but when they were recorded, when they were completed. And then also little information about how each Beatle was thinking about the other Beatles' work during that period of time, what political games might have been going on behind the scenes, and how all of that gets fused into a product. The interesting thing is that the music is more or less the same. I'm not imagining tracks that weren't created. I'm not imagining songs that weren't created. I'm merely taking what is there and rearranging it in a different way. So that's the introduction to the book. I'm going to continue to talk about other subjects in future videos in this series, but you can find this book at SaveTheBeatles.com. You can find it on Amazon. You can find it at BarnesandNoble.com. You can find it at any place that you would like to buy books. It's available. It's available for Kindle, although it's not available for e-readers other than Kindle at this point. It was too complicated to do. And just visit SaveTheBeatles.com, and you can find all the links there and more information there. So that's the introduction. Here's the book, SaveTheBeatles.com. My name is Rick Prescott. Thanks.